Hey everyone, welcome back to another chilling episode of Asian Ghost Stories. Tonight, we're traveling to Japan, where one of the country's most terrifying urban legends continues to haunt the minds of children and adults alike. We're exploring the story of Kuchisake-onna, the Slit-Mouthed Woman, a vengeful spirit born from betrayal and vanity whose question, "Am I pretty?" has become synonymous with death itself. But what happens when someone falls in love with the woman behind the monster, only to discover that some betrayals create wounds that never heal? After I share this heartbreaking story with you, I'll explain the cultural origins of Kuchisake-onna and why her legend has evolved to reflect Japan's changing fears about beauty, relationships, and trust. So make sure you stay until the end. Let me tell you about a love story that ended in the most horrific way imaginable. Set in the quiet suburban town of Hachioji, just outside Tokyo, in the spring of 2018. This isn't just another Kuchisake-onna sighting. This is the story of how someone I'll call Takashi Yamamoto learned that some questions should never be answered, and some secrets are too terrible to forgive. The legend of Kuchisake-onna dates back centuries in Japanese folklore, though it gained particular prominence during the Heian period. She's described as the spirit of a woman whose mouth was slit from ear to ear, usually as punishment for infidelity or vanity. The most common version tells of a beautiful woman married to a samurai who discovered her affair. In his rage, he disfigured her with his katana, asking, "Who will think you're pretty now?" as she died. Now she wanders Japan, approaching people, especially children, asking, "Watashi kirei? Am I pretty?" No matter how you answer, the result is death. Say yes, and she removes her surgical mask to reveal her horrific grin before slicing your mouth. But what makes Kuchisake-onna particularly terrifying in modern Japan is her evolution. She's adapted to contemporary times, wearing fashionable clothing, surgical masks that blend with health-conscious culture, appearing in urban environments rather than rural settings. She represents evolving fears about feminine beauty standards, the pressure for physical perfection, and the violence that can lurk beneath polite social interactions. Takeshi was a 29-year-old graphic designer working for a small advertising agency in Tokyo. Like many young professionals, he commuted daily from his apartment in Hachioji, preferring the slightly lower rent and quieter atmosphere of the suburbs. His routine was predictable. Morning train to Shinjuku, long days designing marketing materials for various clients, evening train home, usually arriving after dark. It was on one of these evening commutes that Takeshi first noticed her. She stood at the far end of the platform at Hachioji Station, a woman in her late 20s, wearing an elegant beige coat and a white surgical mask. Nothing unusual in Japan, where mask wearing is common for health reasons. What caught his attention was her stillness. While other commuters moved with the restless energy of people eager to get home, she stood perfectly motionless, hands folded in front of her, watching the trains arrive and depart without ever boarding. Over the following weeks, Takeshi found himself looking for her during his evening commute. She was always there, always in the same spot, always wearing the mask. Her clothing changed, sometimes a dark blue dress, occasionally a stylish blazer and skirt, once a traditional style coat that seemed expensive, but the mask remained constant. Takeshi began to feel an odd fascination with this mysterious woman. In a culture where public interactions with strangers were rare and carefully regulated, her consistent presence created a strange intimacy. He started timing his arrival to coincide with when she typically appeared, around 8:30 p.m., and found himself disappointed on the rare evenings when she wasn't there. The first direct interaction came on a particularly cold March evening. Takeshi was running late due to a client meeting that had stretched past normal hours. When he reached the platform, she was there as usual, but this time, she seemed to be shivering slightly in the wind. Without thinking too hard about Japanese social protocols, Takeshi approached her. "Excuse me," he said politely in Japanese, bowing slightly. "It's quite cold tonight. Are you waiting for someone?" She turned toward him, and even with the mask covering the lower half of her face, Takeshi was struck by her eyes. They were beautiful, large, dark, with long lashes, but there was something in their depths that he couldn't quite identify. Sadness, maybe, or longing. "I'm always waiting," she replied, her voice soft and melodic, with a slight accent he couldn't place. "But thank you for your concern." There was something about her response that made Takeshi want to continue the conversation, despite the cultural barriers that normally prevented such interactions between strangers. "I've seen you here many evenings," he admitted. "I work in Tokyo and take this train regularly. My name is Yamamoto Takeshi." "Yamamoto-san," she repeated, inclining her head politely. "You may call me Michiko." The pause before she gave her name was slight, but Takeshi noticed it. He also noticed that she didn't offer a family name, which was unusual in formal Japanese introductions. "Michiko-san, would you like to wait inside the station? It's warmer there." She shook her head gently. "I prefer the platform. But perhaps you would join me while we wait for your train." Lest. That was the beginning of what Takeshi would later realize was the most intense and terrifying relationship of his life. Over the following weeks, their evening platform conversations became a routine. Michiko was intelligent, well-educated, and surprisingly knowledgeable about art and design. She asked thoughtful questions about Takeshi's work and seemed genuinely interested in his creative process. What puzzled Takeshi was that Michiko never seemed to actually take a train. Their conversations would continue until his train arrived, at which point she would bow politely and wish him a good evening. But she would still be standing on the platform as his train pulled away. When he asked about her destination, she would give vague responses about traveling later or waiting for the right time. Despite these oddities, Takeshi found himself increasingly drawn to Michiko. She had an old-fashioned elegance that he found refreshing in modern Japan, and her conversation style reminded him of literature from earlier eras, formal but warm, thoughtful but mysterious. The first time he asked about the mask was 3 weeks into their acquaintance. "I hope you don't mind me asking, Michiko-san, but are you feeling unwell? You always wear the mask." Her entire body tensed at the question, and for a moment, Takeshi worried he had offended her. "I have a condition," she said carefully. "The mask helps me feel more comfortable in public." Takeshi, who had grown up in a society where personal privacy was deeply respected, didn't press the issue. But he did notice that after his question, Michiko seemed more guarded, more careful about their interactions. As April arrived and the cherry blossoms began blooming throughout Japan, Takeshi suggested they meet somewhere other than the train platform. To his surprise, Michiko agreed, suggesting they visit Showa Kinen Park to view the sakura. Their first real date was magical, in the way that only spring in Japan can be. They walked beneath canopies of pink and white blossoms, sharing traditional hanami snacks that Takeshi had brought, talking about art, literature, and their dreams for the future. Michiko remained masked throughout the afternoon, explaining, when other park visitors glanced their way, that she was recovering from a cold. But it was during this date that Takeshi first noticed something disturbing. Whenever children approached, running ahead of their families or playing near the cherry trees, Michiko would become very still, watching them with an intensity that made Takeshi uncomfortable. Once, when a little girl of perhaps 6 years old wandered close to their picnic spot, Michiko actually started to stand up, her hand moving toward her mask as if to remove it. "Michiko-san?" Takeshi said quickly, and she seemed to snap out of whatever trance had taken hold of her, sitting back down and turning away from the child. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Children remind me of painful things." Takeshi assumed she meant lost children of her own, perhaps a miscarriage or family tragedy. In Japan's complex emotional landscape, such personal pain was often kept private, and he respected her obvious discomfort. Their relationship deepened over the following months. Michiko would meet him at various locations around Tokyo and the surrounding areas, always in the evening, always wearing her mask. She was affectionate but reserved, allowing him to hold her hand but always maintaining a certain distance. When he kissed her, it was always on her forehead or cheek, never on her lips, which remained hidden behind the white surgical mask. Takeshi found himself falling in love with her mystery as much as her personality. She seemed to exist outside the normal flow of modern Japanese society. No smartphone, no social media presence, no traceable job or family connections he could discover. When he asked about her work, she would say she was between positions, or taking time to consider her future. The first crack in their relationship appeared in early summer. They were walking through Ueno Park in the evening, discussing an art exhibition they had just visited, when a young mother with 2 small children passed them on the path. One of the children, a boy of perhaps 4 years old, looked up at Michiko and asked innocently, "Wane-san, why do you wear a mask? Are you sick?" The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Michiko stopped walking entirely, her body going rigid. She slowly turned toward the child, and even though Takeshi couldn't see her face behind the mask, he could feel the intensity of her focus. The child's mother, sensing something wrong, quickly gathered her children and hurried away, but not before Takeshi heard Michiko whisper, almost too quietly to hear, "Do you think I'm pretty?" The child was too far away to respond, but the question hung in the air like a threat. Takeshi felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. "Michiko-san," he said carefully, "what did you just ask that child?" She turned to him, and for the first time since he'd known her, Takeshi saw something frightening in her beautiful eyes. They seemed to reflect light strangely, almost glowing in the park's evening shadows. "Nothing important," she said, but her voice had changed. It was flatter, more distant. "We should go. It's getting late." That night, Takeshi couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something significant and disturbing. He began paying closer attention to Michiko's behavior around children, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. She was always watching them. In restaurants, on trains, walking through public areas, whenever children were present, Michiko's attention would focus on them with laser-like intensity, and sometimes, when she thought Takeshi wasn't looking, her hand would move toward her mask, as if she were preparing to remove it. The breakthrough came in August, during the Obon holiday, when Japan honors its ancestral spirits. Takeshi had suggested they attend a traditional festival in a small town outside Tokyo, thinking the cultural atmosphere would be romantic. The festival was crowded with families, children running between food stalls wearing colorful yukatas, the air filled with the sounds of traditional music and laughter. Michiko was more tense than Takeshi had ever seen her. She moved through the festival crowds like a predator, her masked face turning to track every child that passed within her line of sight. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, and Takeshi could see sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool evening air. "Maybe we should go," Takeshi suggested, increasingly worried about her behavior. "No," Michiko said firmly. I need to ask someone something." Before Takeshi could respond, she had approached a family with 2 young daughters, probably 8 and 10 years old. The girls were admiring goldfish at a festival game, their parents distracted by making a purchase from a nearby food vendor. "Excuse me," Michiko said to the older girl, her voice taking on that strange, flat quality Takeshi had heard before. "Could you answer a question for me?" The girl looked up politely, as Japanese children are taught to do when addressed by adults. "Watashi kirei?" Michiko asked, her hand moving toward the edge of her mask. The question hung in the air like a curse. Takeshi knew enough about Japanese folklore to recognize it. And suddenly everything about Michiko, her evening appearances, her obsession with children, her hidden face, fell into horrifying place. "Michiko, no!" he shouted, lunging forward to grab her wrist before she could remove the mask. The little girl, startled by Takeshi's outburst, began to cry. Her parents rushed over, and in the confusion, Michiko broke free from Takeshi's grip and disappeared into the festival crowd with inhuman speed. Takeshi spent the rest of the night searching for her, but she had vanished completely. When he finally returned to Hachioji Station, their original meeting place, she was nowhere to be found. For days, Takeshi tried to convince himself that he had misunderstood the situation. Maybe Michiko was just someone with severe social anxiety or a facial disfigurement who had developed unusual coping behaviors. Maybe his knowledge of folklore had made him paranoid, reading sinister meaning into innocent interactions. But deep down, he knew what he had witnessed. The woman he had fallen in love with was Kuchisake-onna, the Slit-Mouthed Woman of legend. She had been hunting children all along, using her relationship with him as cover to get close to potential victims. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Every tender moment they had shared, every conversation, every gentle touch, all of it had been a lie, a manipulation to serve her terrible hunger. Takeshi realized he had been dating a monster, and worse, he had been helping her by providing an appearance of normalcy that allowed her to move freely through public spaces. But understanding what Michiko was didn't diminish what he felt for her. Despite the horror of her true nature, Takeshi found himself missing their conversations, longing for her presence, wondering if any part of their relationship had been real. A week after the festival incident, Takeshi received a text message from an unknown number. "Meet me where we first spoke. Midnight. I need to explain." Despite every rational instinct screaming at him to stay away, Takeshi found himself at Hachioji Station that night. The platform was deserted except for Michiko, standing in her usual spot, wearing a simple black dress and her eternal white mask. "You came," she said softly as he approached. "I had to," Takeshi replied. "I need to understand what you are, what we were." Michiko was quiet for a long moment, staring down the empty railway tracks. "What we were was real," she said finally. "That's what makes this so terrible." How can it be real if you're... Takeshi struggled with the words. If you're what I think you are. A monster? Michiko's voice carried centuries of pain. Yes, I am that, but I wasn't always. Once, I was just a woman who loved too much and trusted too easily. She began to tell him her story. Her real name had been Yukiko, and she had lived in Edo period Japan, the beloved daughter of a prosperous merchant. She had been considered one of the most beautiful women in her district, with marriage proposals coming from across the region. But she had fallen in love with a samurai from a minor clan, a man who wooed her with poetry and promises of devotion. He said I was more beautiful than cherry blossoms, more precious than pearls, Michiko continued. I believed him. I gave him everything, my heart, my body, my family's honor. We were to be married in the spring. But the samurai had been lying. He was already married, and his pursuit of Yukiko had been nothing more than sport, a way to amuse himself during his posting in her town. When she discovered his betrayal and confronted him, demanding that he honor his promises, he had flown into a rage. He said that my beauty was a lie, just like his love had been. He said that if I insisted on being a liar, I should look like one too. Michiko's hand moved unconsciously toward her mask. He used his wakizashi to carve the truth into my face. As I died, he asked me who would think I was pretty now. The transformation from woman to vengeful spirit had taken decades. Yukiko's rage and heartbreak had anchored her to the world of the living, but twisted her into something that could only find relief by sharing her pain with others. For centuries, I asked the question that killed me, she explained. I made others feel the fear I felt, the helplessness, the betrayal. But I was never satisfied. The hunger never stopped. Then why did you approach me? Takeshi asked. Why start whatever this was between us? Because you were kind, Michiko said simply. For the first time in hundreds of years, someone looked at me and wanted to help rather than harm. You offered me shelter from the cold without expecting anything in return. She explained that their relationship had begun as curiosity, but it evolved into something she had thought was impossible for her. For months, being with Takeshi had quieted the rage that usually drove her to hunt. She had begun to hope that perhaps love could break the curse that bound her to her monstrous existence. But the hunger always returns, she said sadly. And it's stronger now because I've tasted what it feels like to be loved again. The betrayal feels fresh, like it happened yesterday instead of centuries ago. Takeshi realized that his love hadn't saved her. It had made her worse by reminding her of what she had lost. At the festival, he said, you were going to hurt that child. Yes. The admission was barely a whisper. I can't help it anymore. The hunger is too strong, and now that I know what love feels like again, the betrayal burns brighter than ever. They stood in silence on the empty platform, two people who loved each other but could never be together. Takeshi understood now that there was no happy ending possible for their story. Michiko was trapped by her nature, compelled to hurt innocent people, while he could never be with someone who would use their love as a cover for violence. There's something else, Michiko said finally. Something I need to ask you. Takeshi felt his blood turn to ice. He knew what was coming. No, he said quickly. Don't ask me that question. I have to. Her voice was filled with centuries of pain. It's what I am. It's all I am now. She reached up and slowly began to remove her mask. Takeshi closed his eyes, but not before he caught a glimpse of what lay beneath, a wound that had never healed, a smile carved in flesh that would never stop bleeding. "Takeshi," she whispered. "Watashi kirei?" Am I pretty? The question that had ended her human life, the curse that had defined her existence for centuries, the words that had killed countless innocents. But now she was asking it of the one person who had ever loved her since her transformation. Takeshi opened his eyes and looked at her fully. The terrible wound that split her face from ear to ear, the blood that would never stop flowing, the beauty that had been destroyed by betrayal and transformed into a weapon of vengeance. "Yes," he said quietly. "You're beautiful." It was the truth. Despite her monstrous form, despite the horror of what she had become, Takeshi could still see the woman he had fallen in love with. Her pain was beautiful in its depth, her curse beautiful in its tragedy, her love beautiful in its impossibility. For a moment, Michiko's eyes widened in surprise. In all her centuries of asking that question, no one who had seen her true face had ever answered yes and meant it. "You're beautiful," Takeshi repeated, stepping closer to her. "You were beautiful as Yukiko, and you're beautiful now as Michiko. Your pain is beautiful. Your love is beautiful. Even your curse is beautiful. Because it comes from a heart that loved too much." Tears began flowing from Michiko's eyes, mixing with the blood that would never stop dripping from her wound. "But I can't stay beautiful to you," she whispered. "The curse won't let me. Now that you've seen my true face and answered the question, I have to." She didn't finish the sentence, but Takeshi understood. The curse that bound her wasn't just about asking the question. It was about what came after, regardless of the answer. "I know," he said gently. "I understand." "I don't want to hurt you," Michiko said, her voice breaking. "You're the only person who ever loved me after seeing what I really am." "Then don't," Takeshi replied. "Break the curse. Choose love instead of vengeance." "I can't. I've tried for months. Being with you was the closest I've ever come to being human again. But the hunger always returns. The betrayal always wins." Michiko reached into her coat and withdrew a straight razor, the blade gleaming in the station's fluorescent lights. Takeshi realized it was probably the same type of weapon that had created her wound centuries ago. "There's only one way this can end," she said sadly. "Either I make you like me, or you stop me, permanently." She held out the razor to Takeshi, handle first. "If you love me," she whispered, "help me find peace. End the curse. Set me free." Takeshi stared at the weapon she was offering him. He understood what she was asking, for him to destroy the only person he had ever truly loved, to commit an act of mercy that would save both her and her future victims. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "There isn't. I've existed for centuries looking for another way. Love came closest, but it wasn't enough. The betrayal that created me is too deep, too old. It's part of my spiritual DNA now." In the distance, they could hear the sound of the last train approaching. Soon the station would be completely empty, and whatever was going to happen between them would happen without witnesses. "Please," Michiko begged, pressing the razor into Takeshi's reluctant hands. "I can feel the hunger growing stronger. In a few moments, I won't be able to control it anymore. I'll hurt you, and then I'll hate myself for eternity." Takeshi looked down at the weapon, then back at Machiko's ruined but beloved face. The approaching train's headlight was growing brighter, casting long shadows across the platform. "If I do this," he said slowly, "will you really find peace?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but it's the only chance I have. And it's the only way to ensure I never hurt anyone else." The train was getting closer now, its brakes beginning to squeal as it prepared to stop at the station. Takeshi realized this was his last chance to board, to walk away from this impossible situation and try to return to his normal life. But he also realized he couldn't live with himself, knowing that Michiko was still out there, tormented by her curse, driven to hurt innocent children. His love for her demanded that he either save her or free her, and saving her had proven impossible. "I love you," he whispered, raising the razor. "I love you too," she replied, closing her eyes. "That's why this is the only way." But as Takeshi steeled himself to end Michiko's centuries of suffering, she suddenly opened her eyes with a look of panic. "Wait," she gasped. "I can feel... there's someone else here." They both turned to see a small figure emerging from behind one of the platform's support pillars. It was a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a school uniform and clutching a small backpack. She must have missed an earlier train and been hiding, too scared to approach the adults on the platform. The child looked up at them with wide, curious eyes, taking in the strange scene. The woman with the horrifically carved face, the man holding a razor, the blood that seemed to shimmer in the train's approaching headlight. "Excuse me," the little girl said politely, as Japanese children are taught to do. "Are you hurt? Should I call for help?" The moment the child spoke, Michiko's entire demeanor changed. The struggle between her human feelings and her supernatural nature vanished, replaced by the predatory focus that had defined her for centuries. The razor fell from Takeshi's nerveless fingers as he watched the woman he loved transform before his eyes into the monster she had always warned him she was. "Little one," Michiko said, her voice taking on that terrifying flat quality. "Come closer. I want to ask you something." The child, sensing danger but not understanding it, took a step backward. But Michiko moved faster than any human could, positioning herself between the girl and the platform's exit. "No," Takeshi said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Michiko, please. Fight it." "I can't," she replied without taking her eyes off the child. "This is what I am. This is what I'll always be." She knelt down to the little girl's eye level, and Takeshi saw the child's face go pale with instinctive terror. "Don't be afraid," Michiko said gently, though her words carried an undertone of something dark and hungry. "I just want to ask you one small question. Can you do that for me?" The little girl nodded mutely, too frightened to run. "Watashi? Kirei?" Michiko asked, her hand moving toward the surgical mask she had replaced over her wound. "Am I pretty?" Time seemed to slow as Takeshi realized what was about to happen. The child would answer. Michiko would reveal her true face, and another innocent life would be destroyed by the curse that had consumed the woman he loved. But in that moment of crystal clarity, Takeshi finally understood what love really meant. It wasn't just about accepting someone despite their flaws. It was about protecting others from the harm that person might cause, even if it meant destroying yourself in the process. The train was pulling into the station now, its brakes screaming as it slowed. Takeshi had perhaps 10 seconds before it stopped and the doors opened, potentially trapping all three of them on the platform together. Without conscious thought, Takeshi threw himself forward, not at Michiko, but at the child. He scooped the little girl up in his arms and ran toward the edge of the platform, shouting over his shoulder, "I'm sorry, Michiko. I'm so sorry for what was done to you. I love you, but I can't let you do this." Behind him, he heard Michiko scream, not the supernatural shriek of a vengeful spirit, but the heartbroken cry of a woman watching the only person who had ever loved her choose to protect others instead of staying with her. Takeshi reached the train just as its doors slid open. He pushed the frightened child inside and turned back to see Michiko standing alone on the platform, her mask hanging loose around her neck, her ruined face fully visible in the harsh station lighting. "Go," she called to him, her voice breaking. "Take the child and go. Don't come back." "Michiko," he started, but she shook her head violently. "This is how it has to end," she said. "You chose to save her instead of saving me. That's what love is supposed to do. Choose the innocent over the guilty. Choose life over death." The train's departure warning began to sound. Takeshi had to make a choice: stay with the woman he loved and risk the child's safety, or leave Michiko alone with her curse forever. "I'll find another way," he called desperately. "I'll research the curse, find some other solution." "There is no other way," Michiko replied. "There never was. This was always how our story would end." As the train began to move, Takeshi saw Michiko walk to the very edge of the platform. For a moment, he thought she might throw herself under the wheels, finally ending her torment. But instead, she simply stood there, watching him disappear into the distance, her blood-stained face illuminated by the station's cold lights. That was the last time Takeshi ever saw her. In the days that followed, he reported the incident to the police, though he carefully edited his story to remove any supernatural elements. He described a disturbed woman who had threatened a child at the station, but when authorities investigated, they found no trace of anyone matching Michiko's description. Takeshi also researched everything he could find about Kuchisake-onna, looking for some method of breaking her curse or helping her find peace. But every source confirmed what Michiko had told him. There was no cure for what she had become. The betrayal that created her was too fundamental, too deeply embedded in her spiritual essence. For weeks, Takeshi returned to Hachioji Station every evening, hoping to see her again, hoping for another chance to find a solution. But the platform remained empty. Local police reports showed no unusual incidents involving children and masked women. It was as if Michiko had simply vanished from the world. The guilt ate away at Takeshi like acid. He had saved one child, but left the woman he loved to face eternity alone, with her hunger and her pain. Every day brought the knowledge that somewhere Michiko was struggling against her nature, that his abandonment had proven to her once again that love was just another form of betrayal. 6 months later, Takeshi received a final message from the unknown number Michiko had used before. "Thank you for showing me what real love looks like. You chose correctly. Don't blame yourself for what I am or what I do. The curse was never your fault, and neither is my choice to stop fighting it. Be happy, Takeshi. Find someone who can love you without destroying others. Why? The message was followed by a series of news reports from various parts of Japan. Missing children, witnesses reporting a beautiful woman in a surgical mask asking strange questions, the Kuchisake-onna legend spreading to new cities, new towns, new victims. Michiko had stopped trying to resist her nature. Takeshi's choice to save the child instead of staying with her had convinced her that she truly was a monster, that love and redemption were impossibilities for someone like her. His act of mercy had become her final betrayal, the proof that even the one person who claimed to love her would ultimately choose others over her. The irony was devastating. In trying to protect innocent lives, Takeshi had driven Michiko deeper into her curse. In choosing love over selfishness, he had ensured that more children would suffer. The woman he had fallen in love with had been capable of fighting her nature when she felt loved and valued, but his abandonment had convinced her that such fights were pointless. A year later, Takeshi moved away from Tokyo, unable to bear passing Hachioji Station every day. He never married, never formed another serious relationship. How could he, knowing that his capacity for love had somehow made a monster stronger? Sometimes, late at night, he would wonder if he had made the right choice. Should he have stayed with Michiko on that platform? Should he have tried to understand her curse better before making such a final decision? Could love really have been enough to break centuries of supernatural torment? If only he had been brave enough to trust it completely. But then he would remember the terrified face of the little girl, and he would know that he had done the only thing his conscience could allow. Love sometimes meant making impossible choices, accepting terrible losses, living with unbearable guilt. The real tragedy of his story wasn't just that he had lost the woman he loved. It was that in saving her from her immediate victim, he had proven to her that she truly was irredeemable. His love had been real, but it hadn't been stronger than his moral obligation to protect the innocent. And that knowledge had destroyed what little humanity Michiko had been clinging to. As I conclude this heartbreaking story, I want to explain the cultural context that makes Kuchisake-onna such an enduring figure in Japanese folklore. Unlike many Western ghost stories that focus on haunted locations, Japanese yurei spirits are typically bound by emotional states rather than physical places. They're driven by powerful feelings, usually anger, sadness, or unfulfilled desires that anchor them to the world of the living. Kuchisake-onna represents several deep fears in Japanese culture: the consequences of feminine beauty and vanity, the violence that can lurk beneath social politeness, and the way betrayal can transform love into something monstrous. Her question, "Am I pretty?" forces victims to engage with her tragedy while simultaneously ensuring their destruction. No matter how they answer, they cannot escape the cycle of violence that created her. What makes Takeshi's story particularly tragic is how it reflects modern anxieties about love and sacrifice. In a culture that highly values social harmony and collective responsibility, the conflict between personal desires and moral obligations can be devastating. Takeshi's choice to save the child was ethically correct, but emotionally catastrophic. He lost his love not through betrayal or infidelity, but through an act of heroism that proved love alone cannot always overcome supernatural evil. The legend of Kuchisake-onna has evolved over centuries to reflect changing social fears, but its core message remains constant. Some wounds are too deep to heal, some betrayals too fundamental to forgive, and some forms of love too dangerous to pursue. Takeshi learned that lesson in the most painful way possible, by discovering that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away, even when it destroys both you and the person you're trying to protect. Could this story be explained rationally? Perhaps Takeshi encountered a deeply disturbed woman with severe facial scarring and psychological trauma, and his guilt over leaving her led him to construct an elaborate supernatural explanation for their relationship. Maybe the subsequent missing children reports were coincidental, or products of urban legend spreading through social media. But in Japanese culture, the boundary between psychological and supernatural explanations is often less important than the emotional truth they convey. Whether Michiko was literally a centuries-old vengeful spirit, or simply a damaged woman whose pain had taken on mythological proportions, the core tragedy remains the same. Love failed to save her, and that failure condemned both her and Takeshi to different forms of eternal suffering. The question that haunts me about this story, and the reason I felt compelled to share it, is whether Takeshi could have made a different choice. If he had stayed on that platform, if he had chosen Michiko over the child, could his love have been strong enough to break her curse? Or would he simply have become another victim, another tragedy in her centuries-long story of betrayal and vengeance? In the end, perhaps that's what makes this story so heartbreaking. There was no right answer, no choice that could have saved everyone. Sometimes love demands impossible sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices destroy the very thing we're trying to protect. What do you think happened? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more true ghost stories from across Asia.